I also took a bit of a different approach on the presentation, and so I'll be very interested in the evaluations, and do feel free to be quite open and frank on your comments. So as you'll see going through, I've really talked about the what's, what are some of the things that have changed, and hoping that you could use the presentation as a bit of a link forward as you go away, and for those on the webinar linkages, to look up particular examples of things that we have done and changed since the terrible events of Lac-Megantic. So I'm going to speak verbally more about the hows and the focus that we took. And then this basically is intended as I say, a carry-away handout. I do have some handouts out of the front table as well, so I'd encourage you to pick those up. So in terms of how we approached the follow-up to Lac-Megantic, I was responsible for the federal rail safety program and also for the dangerous goods program, which is comparable to PHMSA without the pipeline part. So what we did was we talked about strengthening the rules. We talked about a major focus and an outreach to communities, and so how could we address the fears and the concerns that were raised, and I was very interested in yesterday's presentation on the impacts on communities, because that has been a big issue for us. And we talked about, and we did a lot, to try to support the frontline firefighters and the needs that they had to be able to respond to these events, even though in some ways it was not our direct mandate. One of the really good things that has come out of the way that we've been able to respond to this incident is to take a much more holistic approach and look at what the needs are, look at how we can either do that directly from a Transport Canada perspective, or how can we work with colleagues, whether it be other levels of government, etc. And I'll get back to that as I talk about a couple of points as I go through. And finally, the other part is the research and the testing programs that were intended to help us look forward so that we're not taken by surprise again. I think it is fair to say that we were all well aware of the rising volume of oil transport by rail that was occurring very, very suddenly and very rapidly. But what was not as visible and apparent to at least our agency was the change in the product, the change in the crude oil. If you look at the UN classifications, there's only one classification of crude oil. And in fact, it's an organic product, and it ranges tremendously from the types of bitumen in the oil sands, which some levels are not even dangerous goods. They're not inflammable to speak of at all. And then going to the back end crudes and the differences in that kind of crude. Those are some of the things that weren't evident, and so the idea is to have a good research program. So I'll talk about all those things. So as I said, it's a bit busy with linkages, and so the elements that I've picked on here are some of the areas where we changed rules and regulations, and where we put more safety provisions, but also more community outreach provisions in place. The Canadian legal framework, and I won't go into it in detail, but you'll see references here to protective directions and to emergency directives. So we have in our legislative framework the authority for the minister, which is delegated in some cases down to the Director General, who works for me for rail or for dangerous goods, the ability to issue and notice requiring changes that have the force of regulation. And we can do those on a very rapid basis. We've done them in a day or two in some cases. Obviously, we do some consultation with industry. And as we developed all of these protective directions and emergency directives, we work very closely with a group that's called the Federation of Canadian Municipalities. And that's an umbrella representative group that represented all those communities where there were such huge public concerns and fears about the safety of those oil tank cars running through, in many cases, their backyards or they're beside their office building. And so by working with them and developing all of these directives very quickly, and then morphing them over time, as we learned more, we made them more comprehensive. That was a very effective way in addressing some of the community concerns. Obviously, they still were extreme, and there was a lot of concern expressed and a lot of fears that were being expressed to municipal representatives and mayors of our communities, and also in our Indigenous communities to the chiefs and to the other representatives. And so it was important that we reached out to them. So right from the beginning, and I'm not going to go through all the details, as I say, some of these are really meant as handouts, but within a month we were able to put out an emergency directive on the rail safety side that said no train can operate with one single car of dangerous goods with a single operator. It must have two operators at a minimum for any train with even one car of dangerous goods. That was something that was obviously an issue from that accident and that we could see quickly, and so we took an immediate action, which was then morphed later on into a rule. Within 6 months, we were able to issue protective directions 31 and 32, and I just didn't have room in here to write them all out, but those were around the classification of dangerous goods, requiring industry to do more in terms of the testing, and providing us with the information on how they were meeting their legal obligations on testing and classifying those products that they were shipping. And on top of that, we engaged the industry and rail and community representatives to make more recommendations on what else we should do. That was a big outreach that happened within a few months, and it was a large part of the foundations for how we were able to address this issue and make many of these changes in a way that was relatively consensus-based, never completely consensus-based, but pretty close to it. And so then I'll just go to within a year of the incident. So we had developed a comprehensive review of the liability, and I'm not going to speak to that myself, but I just wanted to mention it because it was another big issue. There was a gap in the way that the system was set up. So if I go to the tailored approaches, we took an approach that really focused on the public, on communities, what their needs were, and on first responders, and then of course with industry. And so we divided our approach, and we have different outreach booklets and pamphlets. We have different targeted information packages, and we did obtain additional staff through this process, and some of those staff were actually dedicated to being able to work out in our regional offices and directly work with communities to support their needs. The other key element that I want to speak to, and there's a handout outside, is the Emergency Response Task Force. And on the right you see that little colored area where it talks about how we brought together pretty much everybody that had a role to play or an interest in what was being done in terms of response plans. And on the handout that you'll see outside is a list of not only the groups of recommendations on one side and the very broad areas that they looked at and the achievements to date, but on the back you'll see who the participants were. And it's important to note that we had all levels of government. We had Indigenous community representatives through the Aboriginal Firefighters Association. We had, in fact, a chair that we brought forward from a retired fire chief from an association who had previously been president of the Fire Chief Association for Canada. And we had the fire chief from Lac-Megantic, Denis Lazon, who was actually a member of the panel. And again, a huge contribution by bringing all of these people together to develop the recommendations and to look at what made sense and what were the needs that were being identified. So we used our ability as a convener, not just as a regulator, to address those issues. And so the other part that I wanted to highlight was harmonization. Obviously, it was critically important to work with the international community. As I mentioned, the UN regulations did not differentiate crude oil. We needed to work with other countries to learn from them. It turned out that Europe had a fair amount of back and tight crude, and they had some of the concerns that we needed to share with them what we had learned. And we worked very closely with the US. And so with PHMSA and with FRA, we worked extremely closely throughout that entire period of time to develop, for example, the tank car standards, a very heavy technical set of standards. And we developed those together. We developed a phase-out process for those legacy tank cars that is relatively consistent, not 100%. And we've been able to accelerate that since the time that we developed the standards and put those into place. And then, as I mentioned, there was a very significant amount of safety research and analysis. So I'm just going to touch on the future outlook in my remaining couple of minutes, and thank you for the signals. So future outlook, we have a lot of work continuing on. I can say that the focus and the pressures in this area and the interest and intent of Transport Canada has not flagged at all. We are still taking this as a big part of our workload and priority setting, and it's a big part of my workload. We have a number of initiatives, a new Railway Safety Act review going on right now, a little bit bigger picture. And finally, let me go back on that. I just wanted to highlight our Oceans Protection Program or plan that has been announced by our Prime Minister in October 2016. It's a $1.5 billion investment in a whole set of grouped areas under Transport Canada, Fisheries and Oceans, Canadian Coast Guard, and Environment Canada. And the focuses there are on 4 areas. So we're looking at our ability to create a world-leading marine safety organization, obviously preventing accidents, We're looking at how we can improve our actual awareness of the shipping impacts on the community, on the marine environment, and looking at what we can do to improve habitat restoration. And a key platform as well is to work with Indigenous communities and to actually implement a new way of doing business and work with co-management to actually look at how we develop our approaches to many of these policy areas and new regulations, etc. And so that's a key theme throughout. There'll be more information coming out as this is really the individual announcements are just being made over the next little while as we formalized all the funding elements. So there are some handouts on that as well, and there are some good references if you're able to take a look at them on the website. So I'm going to leave it at that, as much as I say, I could talk for hours, but I think my time is up, and I'll look forward to questions. Thank you.